Chapter 9. Community Engagement in the Black Community with Tekoah B. Flory.
It's not my job to be out in these streets right now. That's your fucking job. My job and my existence is always to be on the front line because I am a Black person in this country and my life is never safe.
I'm your host, Farhana, and welcome to Earth's Narrative.
If you didn't know that shit pierced your heart, how the fuck you gonna heal? If you didn't know you gotta heal your heart.
It's time we heard the stories of real people working on the front lines to make the world better than yesterday. In this podcast, we capture the voices and stories of the mental health advocates, the community organizers, the teachers, the sustainable business owners, the loud and proud change makers of today. We are taking back the pen and writing our own narrative. Earth's Narrative. In this chapter, I sit down with community rights organizer and activist TK. We dive into what it's like being queer and Black in America today, how community organization can and has improved the lives of so many POC communities, and we even get the opportunity to listen to TK's personal experiences with LAPD. Before we get started, I want to make a disclaimer that in this episode, we do discuss police brutality and violence. We understand that these topics can be triggering for some, and if it is difficult for you to listen, we hope that you will join us for our next episode. And with that being said, let's get started. I want to welcome my guest, TK. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yo, blessings abundant. Happy to be here.
Awesome. All right, so TK, can you tell us and the audience a little bit about yourself just to start off?
Yo, for sure. Let me just pull up my own self notes. But off top, I am TK.
Here.
Super prepared, right? Off top, my name is TK. I'm known as King Turnip, which was a phrase coined during the birth of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter comes from a group that was originally called Justice for Trayvon Martin Los Angeles. And so being so hype when we took over Beverly Hills, I was nicknamed King Turnip, which is also TK as in total knockout. But my full name is Tekoah, Barbara Ann Flory. And yeah, I have an abundance of legacy here in Los Angeles. My grandfather is the first Black fire captain of Los Angeles County. And then as well as even on my grandmother's side, her brother is the first Black owner of the Sentinel. Wow. So super deep roots in that. And my great uncle Ishmael, my grandfather's brother, is actually one of the founders of creating the social security system we have in place today.
Oh, seriously? That's so cool. All right. So you came from a whole line of just like strong people. It's like fighting for independence all the way through.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's really interesting to think about how people's politics play out, right? But I mean, as in my personal background, to just digress on myself, I am a queer, gender fluid person who is from Inglewood, born and raised, but I've also organized all over Los Angeles County, as well as gone to different conferences out of state and things like that. Definitely bringing like West Coast values to the East Coast and having that reflected in different spaces. So, and I also just I'm part of a group called Street Dance Activism, and we just actually in August had a 28-day global meditation for Black August. That was incredible. So we were able to link ourselves to, I believe, as of now, I want to quote, we were connected to at least 13 different countries doing a global meditation with us. So,
wow.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff. Okay, I mean, I guess the other question I wanted to ask you is like the role that you see yourself in your community, but I guess you're kind of
Whoa, yeah. What is the role I see as myself in the community? That's a really good question. I think that's a constant question that comes up as I think about my life's work and my purpose, right? Because we have to recognize whatever we do on an individual level is reflected in our community, right? It takes me into Merriam-Williamson's Our Deepest Fear. And our deepest fear is not that we are powerless, but it's really that we are powerful, that we're full of light, that we're full of promise, and that we can truly actually achieve the things we want to achieve. And so thinking about my purpose and the interminglings of community, I would say for me, it's truly in this moment in time is to recognize like my only real job in life is like to stay Black and die, like on some real hardcore, like, where is my life and like what is my purpose to exist, is like I'll have to do is say black and die. But in this moment in time, my true goal in being a conscious person, recognizing how that can reflect on my community in positive light, is to recognize that for Black folks right now, our duty is to heal. Even in this current moment and political time, a lot of people, it was funny, I think it was a couple months back. It was during Juneteenth. I ran into this guy. I've seen him in the circuit for years. I've been an organizer since 2009, and I've known him through my work with BLM. And I saw him, and I hadn't seen him in so long. And he was like, oh my God, he's like, during these George Floyd uprisings, he was like, man, I was looking for you. I wanted to hear your voice on the mic, because I'm known as like a mouthpiece, kind of beacon to set the tone for what our political line is in a really like fun musical way of chanting and drumming. And he was like, yo, I was looking for you, I didn't see you out. And I was very clear with him. He I think he's very ethnically ambiguous in my mind, but not necessarily a Black person of color, right? And I told him straight out, like, yeah, it's not my, like, he's like, I didn't see you and stuff like that out in the streets, and I was looking for you. And I was like, it's not my job to be out in these streets right now. That's your fucking job. My job and my existence is always to be on the front line, because I am a Black person in this country and my life is never safe. But right now in particular, my only duty right now is to heal. One of the most beautiful things I've ever heard, that wasn't coined by Amanda Seales, but I would say regurgitated by her, is to recognize that, like, though we're in a state where we recognize like ancestral trauma can be passed down on a cellular level. Mm-hmm. We're in a time where we can also recognize that ancestral healing can be passed down on a cellular level. So we have to really step into that moment of truth in this time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I totally agree with you. And this is something that, especially since the George Floyd uprising and stuff, when people started to really take to the streets, because, you know, it's like all of the tensions of the pandemic and unemployment and everything. The biggest thing that I've noticed is a lot of people were like, take the time to not ask your Black friends what it is that they're going through, because they need to take this time to heal. Yeah. But you are still out in these streets. I mean, regardless of that, you're still out there doing the work, putting in I just saw you even just engaging with the Latinx community here, you know, having chants in Spanish and things. I find that so admirable, honestly.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, for me, I have to recognize, like, I am a high yellow Black person. And so being that white people feel more comfortable because of my lightness, it is my duty to truly create a voice that is the narration of all peoples, because more often than not, Afro-Latino folks are left out of the conversation. And historically in this country, especially within Los Angeles in particular, Black and brown folks are pitted against each other because we're fighting over these, like, I don't even know what to call them. These like leftover resources that are even given out, right? It's like we have resources for you, but like white people took most of them, especially like white women, like, you know, taking the abundance of accessibility to classes, right? Because white men are on the forefront of like dominating all of this. So then white women are like, me too. And then they're like, okay, cool. Like through, I can't think of the term at the moment, but I'll come back to it. But, you know, it's just like we never have real resources for our community, right? And so we have to create a bridge for folks to truly see themselves a part of this struggle. Because the same things that, like, I'm from Inglewood. I live in the part of Inglewood that is predominantly actually brown folks. And brown is in Latinos, Chicanx folks, but then also Asian folks such as yourself, right? It's such a mixed category, but even when people think about Inglewood due to hip hop, they think of like niggas everywhere. But it's like, actually there's such a diverse community within that space. And so I really try to bring that with me whenever I'm on the mic or something like that. And it's also just like, it's such a beautiful thing to like articulate yourself in another language. One of the most recent conversations I've been having with friends is like, we don't know our native tongue. Especially as Black folks, right? And even Spanish itself is a colonizer language. But like, you know, our ancestors literally spoke in sounds and different vibrations, whereas like white man's words try to make us articulate ourselves in such a finite space that only the things that we say mean these certain associations, which is in part of the resiliency of Black people, right? Is like we say shit in certain ways that really like brings you home. Like even if you say, I'm all right, we'd be like, I'm all right. You know, there's a manner of articulation and vibration that is brought out through the way we do things. So
yeah, but that also like became its own dialect in certain parts of the country as well, right?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, there's so many. I myself have such an eclectic vernacular due to different influences of the partners I've dated and the spaces that they've come from. One of my previous partners was a Palestinian woman. Another one was from Philly, East Coast vibe. So like I say that John over there, like it just depends, you know. But then I'm also like, I will coin myself as a true California boy, BOI, not BOY. And like I have NorCal slang with like South SoCal all the time because that's hella how I am, you know. So yeah, it's all about like recognizing that, like especially in Los Angeles, we're an epicenter of cultural blending. So if we're not bringing that onto the streets, we're really uplifting the oppressive state of erasure of all these different cultures that connect at the center point.
I think it's so interesting that you actually brought up language today, because I was reading Trevor Noah's book yesterday.
Oh my God, I love Trevor Noah. Yes.
Everybody's saying that.
Trevor, you coming soon, boo. We're conjuring you.
My roommate is also just like, we've been at war. Like,
yes.
No, but he mentioned something that I thought actually is just so, he put it so eloquently, and you know, kind of addressed this too, but growing up in South Africa, there's so many tribes with their own languages, and even though he never looked like them, right, because he was half black, half white, and was always considered colored, like, he was able to speak their languages, and it was like bringing them back into the community. And in that way too, I think, you know, like you saying, like the Black American community has been stripped of that because of their identities, but then they've also just created a new one, which...
I mean, that's one of the beautiful things to think about language, right? Like think about patois, right? Patois is a mixture of French and different West African dialects. And people don't even think about how, like, even think about just like the history, because I'm Louisianan Creole. So my family, it's funny to think about the generations. I was pondering that today about how, like, I've heard my grandfather talk about his parents and their grandparents talking about how our survival was really based on how we survived on the plantation. And so they talked about, I've overheard conversations, because I'm also the youngest. So, like, you know, as the baby, I just absorb a lot of stuff. It's never really told directly to me, because that's how we protect our young, right? Or at least historically. But for me, it's like I'm trying to, like, catapult young folks into the conversation so we can really create change. But, you know, like, they survived by sending the lighter folks in our family into the city so that they had access to certain things. But, like, thinking about, like, Creole history as a whole, right? There's, like, hoodoo. Hoodoo is a mix of, like, Christianity and then African traditionalists and stuff like that. So we just have to really pay homage to, like, in particular for people of the African diaspora, it is within our kind of DNA of resiliency to not dominate, but to co-create ourselves in a world that is interwoven instead of just one or the other.
Yeah. I mean, going off of, like, you know, giving an homage to, like, different heritages and stuff, I do consider, like, being queer as its own form of heritage or its own form of community. And so I just wanted you to expand on that. What is it like being queer and Black in America today?
So that's a whole, I'm like, I'm going to unlock the phone on that part. That's a whole intersectionality, like, dissertation within itself. First and foremost, I do want to start off by saying the definitions of queer versus the LBG part of the community, because a lot of folks are unaware of the difference and how there's such an important nuance that happens in that difference, right? A lot of people think of the gay community as the queer community, but there's such a separation in those two. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual hold space for the binary construct within this nation. And so lesbian and gay being that you only date people of the same sex, and same sex being exclusionary of queer and trans people. Also, androgynous or asexual people as well. And then we have bisexual, which is you date within the binary only. But if you're a more woke bisexual person, such as my friend Yasmin Monet Watkins, you are bi and queer in the regard of you date folks who are a beautiful reflection of what you're attracted to, right? In terms of queerness, though, queer in itself is a political term, as in understanding that historically, the gay movement within this nation has been tokenized as white, and whiteness in the sense of the nuclear family, whiteness in the sense of like, we just want to be like these other Americans with their white picket fence, and we want to have access to these different things, but like, we're not like those weird people, meaning we're not like those people of color, or we're not like those, we're just as kind of straight as these straight people, right? Whereas in queer is the full encompassment of everybody else who is gender fluid, who is gender queer. And queer being queer being defined in this country as something that is other. Queer is a reclamation of being defined as other. So queer encompasses not just the LGBT, but it encompasses the Q or encompasses the T and the Q and the AA. So the full acronym right now for the queer community is lesbian, bisexual, or hold on, LGB. Sorry, let me write this down.
LGBTQAA.
Yeah, LGBTQAA. And then there's an ellipses for like everybody else in between. But lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, 2 T's, low key. Queer as the, kind of full umbrella. But then there's androgynous, asexual, and so on. Because there's also, you have to recognize that like, the way that we're defining relationships can be very different to everyone else too, right? Because you have very intimate friendships, right? You have, or just sexual, or you have completely romantic relationships. Like I myself am identified as a queer, gender fluid, gender queer, poly person. Poly in the regard that I have multiple relationships with different people. But one of the things that like happens when I go to like cis heteronormative spaces is that like, you just fuck everybody. And it's like, no, that is entirely a falsity of claiming poly, right? Because we don't recognize, like, you and I are in a relationship, right? And it can be intimate, it can be romantic, it can be sexual or not sexual, right? But we all have different relationships that function within these different categories. And to constantly say that this relationship is only one thing really robs it of its potential down the line. Yeah, when we talk about queer, it's like it's ever encompassing of like all of these spaces we're trying to grow to and grow past. Also to bring it back to the African diaspora, queer people in African culture are actually called gatekeepers.
Oh, why is that?
Because we are the gatekeepers of multiple realms, because we understand and we can look past the binary. We are truly the balance of recognizing the feminine and the masculine, and recognizing that femininity and masculinity are just the duality of giving and receiving. Male seen as giving, whereas femininity is receiving. And so really it gets to the breakdown when you get to queer politics and queer structures, and what are you open to receiving and what are you open to giving, right? And as people, there's always a moment where we're either giving or receiving, right? This is a funny thing. I was just having this conversation with my best friend. Like, I don't understand straight culture.
Yeah.
Because it's so destructive and so violent. Like, especially within, even thinking about the women of like Black female cis hetero culture, right? Like women, and it's just part of hetero culture. Like, why are women pitted up against each other for men who aren't even giving you or receiving the things that you're trying to give or receive to them, right? But you're in this brawl, in this fight that's so violent over these resources. But how is this really a resource if historically in heterosexual community, like these men aren't showing up the ways that they really could, right?
I think the patriarchy is so pervasive towards everybody, though.
Right?
It's like, it just eats out everyone's soul. Like, men are forced to be put in this box,
yep.
Women are forced to be put, and it's not growth for anyone.
Yeah, no, it's unsustainable, right? It's just like, can we kill each other so that we could maybe have sex? And it's like, what do we... and then we detach that from the spirit, right? Like we have to take in the fact that like when you're having sex, it's a spiritual experience. Whether or not you're like fucking just to fuck, or if you're like intimately like, I'm making love to your ass right now, or even if you're like, I'm just making love to a certain particular part of your body, like there is power in what you do. There's power into what you're receiving. A lot of people, especially for women, sometimes we don't think about how the depth and the breadth of like who you sleep with is who you're intertangling yourself with. Sex is such a big deal, and it should be. And it doesn't mean that like you have to be emotionally invested in this person. If you want to go on itch your scratch, because like a lot of us fucking need release, right? Mm-hmm. But also like within like heteronormative culture, like women not coming is a thing. Like, why the fuck are you having sex then? If it's not good for you, why are you engaging in this act? And even if it's a means to get economically stable or something like that, there in some way, if you're being healthy about it, should be a form of pleasure. And pleasure can look like pain, which, you know, you want to be a masochist about it, handle your scandal. We have to recognize that like kink and things like that is a way of dealing with trauma, and it's actually a form of healing. If you completely are able to process something in a different light, you can actually heal in so many ways. But it's like if you're not thinking about it in that scope, you're just reharming yourself. You're just re-triggering these things that ancestrally for you have been so deep. And one of the biggest things for me, and if you get anything out of this podcast as a whole, I want people to think about, you cannot heal unless you know how deep your wound goes.
Yeah.
Right?
You know what? I've never heard it put that way, but it made so much sense. Now that you just said it, I'm like, true.
You know, like, everybody, you know, like, you'll get stabbed, right? But, like, if you didn't know that shit pierced your heart, how the fuck you gonna heal if you didn't know you gotta heal your heart?
Yeah.
You know,
exactly.
you thinking it's like a little scrape. You're like, it was just a tree branch. And you're like, no, bitch, this is an episode of Grey's Anatomy. That tree branch is, like, through your whole body. And you gotta get it together, you know? Because you'll have this, the thing is like, if you don't heal, like, one of the best quotes I've seen this year throughout this global recalibration. I call it the global recalibration. Everybody else is calling it the pandemic. But like literally the globe stopped so that we could literally recalibrate because of all the traumatic shit happening, right? And I'll quote this to say, I don't know where I got it from. Maybe from this woman that I follow, but I'll claim it to a woman of color, of course. But it says, trauma resurfaces itself so that it can have a different weight. Trauma comes up in different ways. Like, unless you've truly healed from something, it's going to come up in different ways, right? Like, you stub your toe, and then, like, 2 days later, you're like, damn, I don't know what the fuck happened, right? And then you're like, and then you look at your foot, and it's, like, purple.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, I didn't just stub my toe. I, like, shattered, like, my knuckle or something like that, right? And so you have to think about how emotions are very symptomatic of physical wounds and things like that. So we can't just take them lightly in the regard if we truly want to move forward. One of the key things to think in mind, I always take it back to nature, right? A tree's canopy, its leaves, only go as far as its roots go. So any tree that you see, it can only expand because its roots underneath in the earth's crust are going that far as well. So if you're not rooted and grounded in whatever you're trying to do, you're going to fall over. And so the same thing goes with, in this breath of thinking about queer and blackness, right? You have to think about, how does your queerness show up in all the different aspects of your life the same way that blackness does? Especially when we live in a world full of binaries, full of colorism. It can be intense.
I wanted to ask because I know that there's a sort of a resistance towards the queer community within the Black community in America too.
Oh,
is there particular challenges that you've been facing, especially again, I didn't realize that BLM was, the inception of BLM actually was from Trayvon Martin, which is years and years ago, even though it's only recently started to become, I guess, more mainstream.
Yeah, I would say kind of catalyzed, right?
Mm-hmm. And how has that, there's two, I wouldn't say they're dueling identities, but they are you know?
Well, one of the biggest things that folks don't know as they come into the mainstream aspect of BLM is that BLM from its inception has always been inclusive of Black trans women, and people in so many ways never acknowledging that Black trans women, we talk about the rate of the death of Black men, right, being like 13-1, whereas the death of Black trans women is double that, if not sometimes triple that.
Yeah, I mean, they're already like a marginalized like community, you know. And what are the challenges that you see like in your activism and in the way that you approach these situations and these, you know,
I mean,
issues?
that goes deep on so many levels. I mean, first and foremost, I think we have to acknowledge that historically, as the Black community in the movement space, those kinds of people and my kind of people, my community, we've been pushed out entirely of those spaces, right? I think one of the best things to show this historically is look at James Baldwin, right? That's actually one of the like founders of the whole March on Washington, yet straight people don't know who that man is. And he's a prominent like queer figure for Black folks who are queer, right? Yet all these cis white people don't know about him. They always acclaim like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King. And I just want to demystify this shit right now and put it on the record. Malcolm X and Dr. King are so similar. And the reason that Martin Luther King actually died was because he finally expressed his emotions on the same tone that Malcolm X did. So there's always this bridge within folks from the mainstream community coming into truly radicalized understandings of Black liberation. And there's always this thing being like, oh, are you like Malcolm? Or are you like Martin? They were on the same fucking page.
It's the whitewashing of history. This is something that happens time and time again when it comes, and it just makes me so mad, especially when people talk about Gandhi in India.
Oh my God.
I'm like, bro, I'm gonna smack you right now. Like, do you think the oppressors care if you starve yourself? They don't give a fuck.
No, they don't. And also like, right, these especially being two women of color talking here right now, right? Like the iconization of these men of color, and how historically, even their past, like they weren't, like people hold them to a pedestal, but let's talk about their real humanity in the sense of both Gandhi and MLK were abusers of their female counterparts, right? Like there are stories about Gandhi physically attacking his wife, same as Malcolm, same as Martin Luther King, right? But yet people hold them to this highest standard. And I don't want to say that or bring it into like to diminish the work that they do, but we have to highlight like the people that need to do the most work are always the people on the front lines. I come from, I guess this segues into my history, right? Of activism. I'll jump into that now. I come from the Labor Community Strategy Center. That's how I became an organizer. So I also want to note to you, I know your questions were about activism, and I want to know I am an activist, but I'm an activist in the sense of I literally activate spaces, places, and people. But I am a trained grassroots organizer. So I've literally been through an entire training called the National School of Strategic Organizing, done by the Labor Community Strategy Center, which was my original political home. Or now I would say Black Lives Matter is my political home of this current time. But the way that I got involved is kind of ironic in so many ways. In high school, I was part of the magnet program at Westchester Senior High, which was one of the last predominantly Black schools in Los Angeles, in LAUSD, to note and figure, which has now become a charter school, ironically. I think it was my junior year. Even though I was in the magnet program, I could not get into the second portion of my geometry class. Like the class, even though I'm priority in math and aerospace, my math class filled up before I could even get into it. So it ended up not having a class I literally just had a gap in my schedule because there was no space for me in my class. Mind you, this is the same year that in my history class, I used to literally sit at my teacher's desk because there was no physical space for me in my classroom, let alone books and things like that.
Typical Westchester.
I mean, yeah, I'm like, off the record, I low-key like literally TA'd that class and didn't actually take it. Like, that's how I learned because of how intensely different our learning levels were, right? I didn't actually need to necessarily participate in that class because I knew the answer to everything, and it was just easier for both my professor's workload and my workload if I just graded tests instead of actually taking them, because you could give me an oral test right then and there and I knew the answers enough that I could grade other people's papers on it. And so,
which it really just goes to show like just a lack of funding in that school too, which I think is directly related to the magnet program, because a lot of, Westchester it's a wealthy area.
It's such a wealthy, affluent social economic area, right?
Yeah, and it's like there's like 10% of the students that have like all the best classes and best teachers.
Oh yeah.
The rest of them are just like lack of funding,
and let's also talk about how that was a breeding school for athletes, right? And just putting them in this realm of just being like, yeah, you don't need an education. You're just gonna be like in the NBA or the NFL. Like, it doesn't matter. I mean, our football team suck, but basketball is killing it. Like, a lot of those people, even within my grade level, have gone on to play professionally, if not excel on the college level, right? And so, yeah, in Westchester, I didn't have a course, and I'll never forget, this is like one of my favorite moments in life. I'll never forget, I didn't have a class. My girlfriend was a senior. She also didn't have a class at the end of the day. And so we were literally sitting out in front of campus, because like I'm such a nerdy kid. Like, I was the kid that like went to the library after school, you know. I was like using the library card hella hard, because my first interaction with Westchester was truly with Mr. Terranova, who is now a dear friend of mine, Andy Terranova. And I knew him since I was a freshman in high school, and he was actually the teacher who held space for Taking Action, because he came from the center. But it's funny because my intersection with him at the time was he was the first teacher to say yes to having a gay-straight alliance, to be the faculty advisor for that club. So I knew of him through Gay-Straight Alliance, and I remember him like trying to plant seeds of me to like activate as an activist, right, or as an organizer. But I had never like really heard him until that day that I was like outside of class and was like, oh, who's that woman? And so then Marina then went on to say that, oh, that's Lisa Adler. Remember back when the teachers were striking? She's part of that organization that was holding space for us having better access to education. And so I was like, what? That sounds pretty cool. So I think that day I went to Taking Action after school. And that was at the time, which is so crazy because this is like my destiny, right? My fate within this world to become this person I am today. At that time, they were interviewing students to become part of the Summer Youth Organizing Academy. The Summer Youth Organizing Academy is actually a youth version of the National School for Strategic Organizing. So I'm also one of the only people, along with Elmo Gomez, to be part of the class that has gone through the Summer Youth Organizing Academy, as well as the National School for Strategic Organizing. So like when I say I'm heavily an organizer, like my shit is like,
it's in your blood.
It's deep. It's deep. Since 2009, I've been an organizer. And back then I would say I was more of a youth organizer, even though today, like, I'm the youth. If I get to be the youngest person in the whole place, I definitely would take that, because like the inner child in me is like, I gotta heal too. And I'm like, yes, bitch, you do.
I love that.
And so, yeah, it was crazy. So it goes from becoming part of this group, Taking Action, which is an after-school program where we provide a space for students, and students of color in particular, to get access to knowing their rights. Like, as a student, what are your rights on campus? Especially in the spectrum that a lot of people are unaware that Los Angeles Unified School District has the largest school police department in the whole nation. New York School District is larger than us, yet our police force is larger than theirs. how the fuck does that make any sense?
Well, didn't they just increase the police budget?
Yeah.
Like, very recently.
Our current LA City budget for police is 53%. Meanwhile, let's just talk about California's fucking burning like a motherfucker. Like,
we had to get firefighters from Mexico to come help us in the fighting the fires in Oregon.
That part.
Just like, no.
That part, and then we're just glossing over the fact that there are prisoners who are actually fighting fires and they're getting paid like 5 cents a day for fighting a fire.
Well, the good thing is that I think Governor Gavin Newsom just signed off on a bill that allows, non-violent offenders to pursue firefighting once they are released from prison, which I think is great. That's actually a step in the right direction.
That's actually one of the bills, I can't remember, it was like AB 1070, I think, that we've been pushing for over the past few months this year.
Oh, okay.
To finally get activated. Yeah, so that
must feel really good.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, especially doing this kind of work, we have to claim our victories or else other people will take those, right? Back to Westchester. So, I went after I started going to this after school club, and then I applied to do the Summer Youth Organizing Academy. And like, I had no idea what this was gonna be, what I would be doing. I was just like, this sounds cool. I'm down to like fight for my rights and like to tell other kids like what their rights are, right? Especially because at Westchester, I was one of those kids that was like always out of class, but like out of class due to administrative work. I worked in the dean's office, I worked in the magnet office, I worked in a lot of different offices. And so much to say, like, a spectrum of my life. And what's ironic is I played soccer at Westchester, right? And my little sister, I call her my little sister, even though she's a year older than me, Maddie, to think about our spectrum and our relationship together, I actually was the student to give her a campus tour of Westchester. And then she ended up playing soccer, and that became my little sibling. Like, that's how involved I was, but not necessarily thinking about how involved I was. I never realized that till like after high school, that I was like, oh my God, I was the kid who like gave you your high school tour. So I applied for the Summer Youth Organizing Academy, and that was interesting too, because they were like, oh, we want to talk to like your mom and like tell them what this is and stuff like that. And I was like, okay. And I was like, I don't know, Ma, you got to go to this building and they're going to tell you about something. And it's so funny because I'll never forget that day too, because she like went and I was like, oh, cool. Like, how was it? And she's like, oh my God, I love Patrisse Cullors and I love Carla Gonzalez. And as you may know now, Patrisse Cullors is coined as one of the founders of Black Lives Matter global movement. And so, it's funny to think about our relationship and how far we've come since that day.
It's very inspiring to hear her speak too.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of, that's one of my people, one of my friends that I'm like, I've always looked up to her, and like I recognize how I can be a beacon myself within that, right? And yeah, it's so crazy. So did the Summer Youth Organizing Academy, and my class is part of a class to survey over 15,000 students in Los Angeles around truancy. So back in the days of forever ago, just kidding, back in the days of like 2009 to 2011, we had, it doesn't still exist. I think it marinated about 2015. But I was I did the Summer Youth Organizing Academy, which comes from the, Labor Community Strategy Center. But the Strategy Center, I'm like, there's so many umbrellas that I have to break down, So the Strategy Center is an umbrella organization for a campaign known as the Bus Riders Union. So the Bus Riders Union is known throughout Los Angeles because we are the people who pushed MTA to give us the public transit access we have today. So like the rapid buses in Los Angeles are a direct result of us organizing people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so like all these things that people take for granted in Los Angeles.
I just think sometimes it's like, for me, it's like, yeah, exactly what you're saying. It's like, that has always existed in my life. I'm just like, hey, there's like a blue rapid. I know it's going to take me to SMC.
Yeah.
And you just never think, there was like people fighting for that.
Yeah. So back in the day, like MTA, like we have a whole song and it's like, I ain't got a car, but I live in LA. We have different like little documentaries. I'm actually in a couple documentaries. When I think about it, kind of interesting. Like a pen for my life and timeline. But yeah, back in the day, Metro was so bad that like when we were organizing, like there was a whole time where like MTA went on strike, and the bus riders union actually created the People's Caravan, in which we went from bus stop to bus stop, putting people in cars so that they could get to work, they could get to school and things like that, so that people had access.
So crazy to me, like, and maybe it's just because I'm literally just started reading this book yesterday, but it's so crazy to me how, like, the American Black experience is just parallel to the experience during the apartheid. Like, that's scary to think about, but it's like, Trevor Noah is talking about minibuses and how they weren't allowed a metro or like a public transportation system in South Africa, so they had their community just build it up for them.
Yeah, and that's the thing that people don't recognize is like one of the things, so bringing us into the community rights campaign, one of the things that we noticed when, which is what Patrice Cullors and Carla come out of, they created the community rights campaign along with Manuel Criollo and Zoe and different folks, and Eric Mann, who's the head of the whole organization, who comes from union labor work, was that a lot of the people that we would meet on the buses via organizing were people's always having some kind of intersectionality with either the justice system, the foster care system, the school system, right? Mm-hmm. And as we were organizing on the buses, it came out of us actually doing a survey of student bus passes for LAUSD students. Like, LAUSD students now have access to a student bus pass.
Oh, okay.
That is literally the work from the Bus Riders Union, us creating that kind of avenue, because we realized that the people on buses are low income, majority people of color. I mean, majority of people of color saying that like 95% of the people that ride the bus are people of color, right? A lot of them have some kind of interaction with either the court system, the prison system, whether it be foster or, when you're an inmate, they give you a bus ticket and that's it, right? Like now they give you like a bus token, if that, right? And then they're like, well, bye, and then you're just like, oh, I have to rebuild myself, even though I'm like such an outcast in society, right? And so through that work, we were able to see this lens into what is now widely known, thank the heavens and thank the universe to do our work, as the school to prison pipeline. We are the pioneers of actually using the language to talk about the school to prison pipeline, because during my class of the Summer Youth Organizing Academy via the Community Rights Campaign, we saw that sectionality of students riding the bus was how law enforcement was creating an entrapment system around them and pushing them into the prisons, right? So to simplify it, Los Angeles had, because we amended it, victories. Los Angeles has a code called LA City Code 4504, and it stated that any student caught outside of school grounds from the first bell to the last bell could receive a truancy ticket. And these truancy tickets could go up to $200, $250, but in court costs and fees, they could go up to about $5,000. So you're caught outside of school, and it could be a $5,000 ticket for your family who's already poor and struggling. That probably makes less than $10,000 a year on average, especially in certain low-income communities of Los Angeles, right? When the cost of living, I mean, even if we think about back then, was probably around 100,000, right? In certain areas, especially Los Angeles, because like depends, all the borders, like especially like thinking about Westchester, right? In itself, like the economy of that city, on average, I would say most of those people made about 70,000 to 150,000, and that's like their medium, right?
Of Westchester?
Yeah.
And that's a little bit low.
I know.
It seems a little low.
But I'm talking about back then, not like current.
Yeah.
I mean, current, no, it's in the millions. But back in that time, because that's over 10 years ago. I mean, I graduated in 2010. So if we think about 10 years back, I think that would be an accurate portrayal around that. I mean, it still seems very low even for us, but like if we're being nice around here, around their numbers, right? So things to take into account when you're riding the metro bus. As a student, students could come into contact with 3 different law enforcement agencies in one interaction. So you have the Los Angeles School Police Department. We talked about that being the largest in the nation, right? Even though we're the 2nd largest district. Then you have the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. Then you also have the Los Angeles Police Department. So students who are not adults could have multiple interactions with 3 different agencies on their way to school. And especially if you're a student who doesn't know your rights, right, around people coming at you to try to incriminate you, there's so many easy ways that you could get caught up, right? You get onto a bus, say you don't have enough for fare, MTA can call the police on you, and it could be one of these agencies, right? But then it gets so easy, it becomes like, it goes from a truancy ticket, right, of like, oh, you're not in school at the right time, so you receive this ticket, right, to being an entrapment of like, you have a Sharpie marker on you, so you've been tagging, so let's give you a graffiti ticket as well. That's another court date. That's another day that your parent or caretaker.
It's just targeting children of color, lower income, I mean, we can go on and on about the police system, but, you know, I know you were talking about a bunch of, like, different organizations and stuff, but, like, what is something that you are working with, like, now that you want people to know about, that you feel like, you know, like, if they're going to go and support, like, go and check out this organization. I know a lot of it, too, that you work in is, like, for Los Angeles, so for LA
so in
locals.
Particular in Los Angeles, but just on a real thing, I think when I think about what is my political line today that I want to really bring to the forefront is we're in a global protest of reimagining public safety. A lot of people don't think about how we need to create a new system. Just thinking about LA city funding as a whole, right? We spend 53% of our funding on policing. And that means probation, having caseworkers and such like that, but only in the crimination system, right? But like none of this money is going towards mental health workers. And this money is going to social welfare systems, right? But also right now we're actually, we're pushing for Measure J. So yes on J here in California for folks to push for 10% of our budget to go towards newly engineered systems for community wealth.
Is this something people can vote for?
Yes, within this. Yes, in this upcoming election. Yes, please vote yes on Measure J. I mean, it's literally like vote yes on everything except for 21. Like vote no on 21 and vote yes on everything else. Okay. Because everything else that we're pushing for right now is about community development. I myself am from Inglewood, right? Inglewood, a lot of folks don't know, during this development of the stadium, I can see it from my house, only 5% of our city's budget is going towards affordable housing.
It's ridiculous. Is there like a website that people can go check out these measures that you're like highlighting so they can be better informed about
campaign
vote?
So I would like to uplift groups like LA Can. Mm-hmm. Also Campaign In is doing a lot of work. Always please follow at Black Lives Matter LA. So BLM LA on Instagram. You can also go to our website, which is blmla.org, and you can see all of the things that we're intersectioned with. But there's so many different measures. I mean, ultimately, whether or not you agree with my politics, one of the biggest things is like, please educate yourself to become aware of the things that are actually happening. A lot of people spend too much time on national attention when it's really at a local level that these things have the most impact. And so we really have to get into how we as a community can really create a difference. I would love to share a story about how when we talk about reimagining community safety, I want to share right now about a story that happened last Saturday, actually, with me. Because I am a community-oriented person, I felt the need to step up in a moment. And I want to share this to recognize that anyone can do this, to truly reimagine public safety. So last weekend, I went to recycle, right? Because like on some real shit, everybody should be recycling. It's 2020. Like if you're not thinking about how we're reusing things versus creating a sense of waste, like we're really only hurting ourselves as a community. And if you have kids, you're only creating more difficulty for their future. And so last weekend I went to recycle near the Food for Less in my community, right? Where like that will give you the tone of the socioeconomic area, right? And it was interesting. I entered the parking lot and I saw these people in a car driving around, and I could like, I am a trained Reiki healer, so I could like energetically feel their kind of shift. But then while I was mid sorting, we heard, the people in that area heard a cry out from a woman screaming, "Please help, call the police, I'm in danger," right? And so while I was recycling, before we heard that, I remember seeing a young man of color and another woman, and like seeing some guys around and stuff like that. And I was like, hey, I turned and I looked at them and I said, you guys need to come with me and we need to go have community engagement in this situation. Because we all know that calling the police is only going to end up with another Black man being killed in our community, because as we did the work as the community rights campaign, police more often than not will tell you, we only have certain tools in our toolbox and we're not equipped to deal with these situations. Yet you're the people called for these situations, right? And so this is a moment of reimagining community safety, right? So I myself walked over along with this young Black man, and I believe it was either his aunt or grandmother, like another generation of his heritage, right? And then this man who appeared to be without a home also engaged, and we walked over and I simply said, hey, this is a community intervention and we're here for you, and we want to recognize that there's a child here with y'all and we need to make sure that they're safe. Because at the end of the day, I recognize everybody's going to have their own struggle and things like that, but we have to recognize that the future is literally in our hands, right? And we don't want this child to witness the abuse of their mother or things like that, right? And not to say that abuse is okay either, but also to think about the direct impact of literally seeing these things at a young age, right? And that's where like trauma gets passed down.
Absolutely.
And so it was a beautiful moment. This guy came over, the without a home man came over, and he was like, hey man, you're going to go to jail if you keep engaging this way. Like, we're trying to separate you two. So I was able to like, not necessarily hyperly like physically engage, but I just like tapped him and I was like, hey, we're your community, please. Like, he was like pulling the child out of the mother's arms, and you could see the physical wear on the woman. And so like the young man and his female caretaker stepped over, and they like held space for her, where I was able to talk to him, get him to release the child back to their mother, and just take some space. Because for myself, I'm like, I know that I can have an impact with this young Black man to get him to recognize the harm he has done, but also like recognize that this is a moment he can choose to do better. So she continued to talk with the other folks. I acknowledged her and just being like, hey, we love you, we're here for both of you. And like, they handled her while I handled him. And so I began to engage with him, and I was like, hey, I recognize that you've probably seen harm done within your family and the people who have taken care of you. And I want you to realize that I know in your deepest heart that this is not something that you wish upon your child. And he was like, no, I don't. And I was like, okay. And I want you to know that you have to forgive yourself here in this moment, to notice that this is not your intention, but that you can do better. And we went through a whole, it's probably even, I probably spent maybe like 30 minutes to 45 minutes with him, just going through a whole of like, he is an, I don't want to say uneducated, but sparsely educated, I say, is a nice embellishment, right? Sparsely educated Black man who survived the foster care system. He doesn't have his GED, which goes into his current financial problems around having a child and not being able to provide for them, especially on like a hot ass day in California. Mm-hmm. You know, like, we're stuck in the car, heat tension's gonna rise and things like that. And like, you know, some of his initial things were just like, she's always aggravating me, and like, I don't want to be violent, but like, I just felt provoked. And I called him out, or I called him out to call in a sense of calling him in, though. People don't talk about the politics of like, you have to call people in instead of calling them out. The police call you out and then they kill you. Whereas as a community, it's our duty to call people in to recognize like, oh, we could just have a conversation and reflect on what are the things we can do moving forward instead of just harping on what has already happened. And so I called him in the sense to be like, hey, if you could do anything what would you rather be doing than feeling these emotions? Especially as people of color, we're always taught to like think about what's the worst that could happen. And it's like we have to really reframe and re-educate ourselves around what's the best thing that could actually happen in this situation, right? Like, especially when we think about public safety, what are the best things that can actually happen instead of the worst? Like when people think about and justify having police in our communities, right? They're like, well, the worst thing that can happen is like there's a rapist and like they rape all these people and like nobody's doing anything about it, and like people are getting kidnapped or they're being harmed physically, right? But what's the best thing that can happen when we actually look at the root of the problem instead of just these situational options for harming others in because they're harming other people? Because one of the things that they say about like gunmen and mass shootings, right, is that if you humanize yourself and talk to them and say, hey, I'm a person, I'm from this community, this is my family, this is how they feel about me, that brings that person into that moment of being like, oh shit, before I was just a machine and I was killing, but damn, now I'm a human too, and this is a human in front of me and I should not actually harm them. And so it became a moment in which where I was interacting with him where he was just like, he was so thankful, and he was like, thank you so much for choosing to see the best in me instead of the worst. Because quite honestly, I don't think ever in his life somebody has ever done that. But how simple is that? To literally create a future for a child, for a Black child, for us to give this man some space to actually feel his emotions. Especially when we talk about like the queer community, right? It's truly understanding like masculinity is not a monolith, right? It has so many, ins and outs and so many spectrums. And so when we talk about reimagining public safety, when we talk about healing our community, we have to think about what are the ways historically we've been going about this, and how can we truly create a difference in revenue around it, right? Like how different would this guy's life be if I was a person with financial capital and power to just be like, oh, you perhaps just need a roof over your head for a month, and then that'll get you on your feet and you won't feel stressed out and strained by all of these exterior problems, right? And we're at a moment in time where it's like, it's never too late to actually do that shit today, right? Like if we gave that guy a space to live today, the future is so much brighter for him versus just putting him into a cage and locking him up and saying like, you don't mean anything to our society. Because that's what happens when you have this intersection with police, when you have this intersection with the system and people. I myself have been, we were talking about this earlier, I've been arrested twice, right? Mm-hmm. So the first time I was arrested, it was for shutting down the 405 freeway on the busiest day of travel in the year. And yes, I did shut down the freeway in Inglewood because Black people in my neighborhood are dying at a rapid rate and nobody's actually doing anything about it. So yes, I will cause you the inconvenience of traffic so that you can take a moment to reflect and mourn with the families that have to even leave their community because they can't afford to live it because I have to pay for a funeral. And when going through that process of being charged, at first they didn't even tell us whether or not they were charging us. Even in that process, I dealt with two different police agencies, Highway Patrol, being taken to Culver City, and then I was processed and put into high power jail at Linwood. And even within that interaction, like having masculine cops over my body, being patted down and things like that, and then having like a female officer present, but you could see the disingenuousness of her power being taken away from her as well, being around these like hyper masculine figures, right? Like, I mean, low-key, like even she didn't feel safe. And then she was like, oh, I'm not from this jail, they're gonna talk down to me and talk to me condescendingly because I'm not even from this jail. Versus like, like I am a woman, I am a police officer, mm-hmm. but like even I don't feel safe because I don't even know this space. And that was like one instance, right? And the process of that, of being charged with felony conspiracy charges. I conspired to commit a felony. Not that I committed a felony, I conspired to commit a felony. Weird. It's the craziest shit in the world because you're just like let me have felony charges, versus like a conspiracy. Like I didn't even commit some shit, but you thought I committed some shit, like what? And in that process of dealing with felony conspiracy charges, I was literally on probation for a year. So that's a year of my life in which I had to literally exist on eggshells. And as a Black queer person in my community, I already exist on eggshells. Like, I have moments where I'm passing as masculine and moments when I'm not. And in terms of safety, like, part of my existence is like I'm a longboarder. I'm a longboard dancer because it was safer for me to skate through my community than to be a woman walking down the street. And I pass as masculine because I choose to dress androgynously so that I am a little bit safer, so that perhaps I won't get kidnapped off the street, you know? But within that year, like, I'll never forget, I had the opportunity to go to Canada while I was on spring break. And I was not allowed in the country because our government hadn't processed me yet. And the Canadian government, I've never felt so violated in my life, body searched me. They went through all of my belongings. They read all of my poems in my sketchbook. They took apart all of my things, and then would not let me in their country, and then shipped me back to Chicago, which, thank the heavens that BLM has emergency funds so that I actually had a roof over my head instead of just being like low-key assed out in a entirely different city that I'm not familiar with. And so that was one instance of being arrested, and just tells you like I'm an educated Black person, and that was my experience. But the most recent experience of being arrested was in June of this year. I went out with some friends, and it was after curfew. And I'll acknowledge that it was after curfew, but we had gone out, wanted to see what was happening in the streets. We went to a couple of spaces, and then we saw or heard that people were in Hollywood. And so we went to just go make sure. For me, I felt a calling, just like trusting my intuition. I felt a calling to be like, hey, those people are walking to their vehicles. Let's make sure that they get to their vehicles. So we're driving down the street, making sure that people get in their cars and stuff. And then we're literally entrenched upon with Los Angeles police department, and I would say there's probably about 30 cops in cop cars on this side of us, and then about 50 to 60 law enforcement on this side, and we're trapped on Gower Street in between Santa Monica and whatever small street is above it. And that was one of the scariest moments of my life thus far, because during that situation, I almost died. I was literally shot at by police, and
they shot your phone, right?
Yeah. So to give you the play-by-play, we're in the car and we see them like block off this other car, and so there's like this like funny video, because I love comic relief, because we either have to laugh or cry, right, in order to release. And somebody has this video of like my friend Lisa trying to do this like 4-point turn of being like, fuck, we can't go that way, okay, let's try to turn around, and fuck, we just gotta like, we're completely surrounded, so we can't get out of this, right? So I'm in the car with my friends. The irony of us being like, before we went there, right, we're like, we don't want to get arrested, we don't want to be out late, we're just gonna like go through and then we'll come back home, right? And now we're in the car, we're clearly gonna get arrested, and like our lives are in the hands of these over 100 police officers who literally have their guns out, drawn and pointed at us in our vehicles. And so the car next to us, the police are like coming and like closing in on it, and they're like screaming at them like, get the fuck out the car, we're gonna bust the windows, we're gonna shoot you guys, like all this shit, right? I had my phone on Instagram Live, and so I'm like recording them, and I peek my head out the window and I'm like, put your fucking guns down, like none of us are armed, you're expressing all of this violent, like just like, it was so intense, because it's just like your guns are out, like none of us have, like all these people just came from a protest and getting back into their vehicles. Now it's some real shit, people of color know not to be fucking loaded when you're going to a protest. That's just intent to be shot, let alone having a sign that says please don't shoot me getting shot at, right? And so my friend Lisa's partner, he's like, hey guys, I'm gonna get out, I think you guys should too. And so I'm like, okay. And so I like put my wallet in my friend's car, because I'm like, okay, they'll just impound the vehicle, but they won't have all this stuff. And I'll never forget my friend Tahir, she actually graduated from UCLA, and she told me one of the things that she does to remain safe, anytime that she's pulled over, she keeps her UCLA ID in front of her driver's license. So what I did was I pulled out my Santa Monica student ID and I put it in my hand, left my regular ID in the car. So I was like, okay, I just have my ID on me, took everything else out of my pockets. I don't need to have anything else, because like on some real shit, like all my friends in that car were people of color, like Latinx and Asian descent, where I'm like, I'm the only black man in this fucking car, right? And so they all get out of the car. I'm the last person to get out, and you know, all these guns are pointed at us. I'm like, please put your gun. I'm screaming at them the whole time. Like, I lose my voice that night later on, and I'm like screaming at them, like, please put your guns down. None of us are armed at things like that. And then I finally get out of the car, and I realized, like, you know, I was recording this whole time, and I'm like, oh my God, TK, you have your phone in your hand. Put it down before they shoot you. I literally put it down. 1 second later, all I see in my peripheral is it flying through the air in pieces, because somebody has shot in my directionality. And that is one of the craziest moments in my life, because not only did I live through that, but I have a partner, Jermon, who is locked up in a prison. He's been locked up for quite some years now, and we'll be getting out soon. We're manifesting that. And he's locked up because he defended himself against a homosexual hate crime. But of course, if you have priors, then there's more work that has to be done on your end, because our system's so rigged, right? And I will never forget a couple weeks later receiving a letter from him saying, babe, I saw you on TV get shot at and my heart stopped. And then also coming into today, where I have different friends and things like that, and they're like, I'm so thankful that you're alive, because I literally watched on live TV you get shot at. And it's so crazy. Like, so to go on about that night, right? I get out the car. The police are screaming at me to come to them with their guns out. Like, would you walk into a group of people with their fucking guns out at you, telling you to come to you? Meanwhile, they have everybody else lined up against the wall. And so I'm so thankful to my friend Lisa, who was like, I got out the car, have my hands up, my ID's in my hand. If you ever see a photo of this, I'm wearing a highlighter jersey. I'm the only nigga that's skating around LA with the highlighter jersey that says Black Lives Matter. And then it says Black Love Matters on it, because people need to recognize that at the root of white supremacy, it seeks to destroy Black love. So having Black love, in essence, literally dismantles the properties of white supremacy, because when we have Black love, we create spaces of Black joy, which means that we can actually heal. And so I get out the car, they're screaming at me to come to them. I'm like, fuck, do I have to come to them? And I'm like, they are speaking at me and I understand, you know, I'm like, what do you do? You know, because like you can go through all the training in your life, but in that moment,
nothing prepares you for something like that.
Right? Like, and so then I will never forget my life. Thank you to Lisa. Literally, Lisa was like, TK, you bring your ass over here and you get the fuck behind us. And I was like, okay, Lisa. So then I go and I walk over there and I get behind the people sitting against the wall. And like, even while we're sitting there, they're trying to still tell me to get up. They're like, no, you fucking stand up. You in the yellow, like you stand up. And I'm like, it's neon, bitch. So don't be telling me it's yellow. Because also the artist in me is like, fuck your color terminology. And they're like they're still trying to get me to come over there. And then they're like, and then I just sit there and Lisa's like, no, you stay with us. And then they pick us up like one by one. I literally had about 4 to 5 different officers on my person, handling my person. Do you want to know a fun fact? None of these police officers that were responsible for my life lived in the city of Los Angeles.
So where did they all come from?
Different cities. Like some of them were from super far away, like middle of California. Like people travel miles. And like especially during this time, at a time when our president in this moment, 45, called in the National Guard. So not only was it like LAPD there, later on when we're like standing against the wall and they're taking all of our original information, there's the National Guard behind us too. And like, you know, the police have like Glocks and shit, but then what does the National Guard have? AK-47s and things like that. And people aren't, something I want people to be very aware of too is that the military has a miscellaneous budget. Anything that the military does not use gets sent to local law enforcement agencies. So just here in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Police Department has access to, this was back in 2012 that I knew this information, had access to about 4 tanks. So could you imagine Now, 8 years later, what other access to these lethal weapons that they have, right? And so, yeah, it was just a whole crazy night. They separated us into 2 different groups. They filled up like a decommissioned school bus. And I was like so proud of my friends. Like, this is why they're my friends. Because they were lit on that bus. They were like chanting, singing Black Lives Matter. Like, it sounded like low-key they were going to like a liberation summer camp. And I was like, okay, y'all. And then the person in front of me gets on the bus, and then they get to me and they said, there's no room for you on this bus. So at that time, I'm literally separated from my friends. And that is the moment that I realized there is no way for me to contact anyone because I don't even have a phone. Like, it's not like my phone's in their custody. It was literally shot to pieces. And so then they line us against the wall. And this is also like to think about the depth of this situation, right? So we're on Santa Monica and Gower. You know what else is also on Santa Monica and Gower? The Hollywood Cemetery. So my back is to the Hollywood Cemetery, and I'm literally standing in front of an abandoned building with over 60 police officers with their guns at my back, with a group full of people. And I want to note that about 4 to 5 men a part of this group, Black men a part of this group, were in their scrubs, literally in their scrubs with their medical badges on them, also being detained and arrested. Right? I'm a drummer and chanter, so I literally sang most of the time because I know that if we're silent, it makes it easier for them to kill us. So I sang majority of the time, made sure people were safe, checked in on them and stuff like that, which is something that we did while the other group was there. Like, my friend was Lisa, was like, TK, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm okay. And they were like, Sergio, are you okay? Are you okay? Okay. You know, like, you have to check in on people. And the bus I ended up on in particular was also very scary. So it was an actual real LA County Sheriff's bus. So we were put into singular cells on a bus.
Damn.
So, like, you're in a cage on a bus. And then they would not tell us where we were going. They took Sergio and them to San Pedro. Luckily, they took us to downtown. Thank the universe it was downtown, because Black Lives Matter Los Angeles has the longest encampment in history at City Hall. From a couple years back. And so I was like, thank God I know downtown. Because one, I grew up, my cousins are also Japanese. So I grew up going to Little Tokyo and being culturally aware and things like that. But then also it's like, I skated this shit the whole time I was camping out downtown LA. And like through the community connection, like while I was on that bus, I was so thankful. My friend Sergio had befriended somebody else on his bus and was like, hey, is that your partner on that bus that I think my friend's probably on? And he was like, yeah. So Sergio was able to contact me through this girl, because I'm like sitting on this bus and I'm like with this other girl who was really sweet. We even have a selfie in the bus because, you know, OG like that. And I'm like sitting on this bus. I'm like, fuck, I don't have a phone. How am I going to contact anybody? I don't even, like, I know one number. I know my cousin's cell phone number because my mom uses it for, like, you know, the CVS and Ralph rewards, right? Because it's 2020 and we don't know anybody's contact. And I'm sitting on the bus, like handcuffed. I think I was like handcuffed behind my back with zip ties, which luckily they were not too tight. And I hear like, is there a TK? I was like, that's me. That's me over here. And so this girl's like, Sergio and Lisa and them are in San Pedro. They're going to get the car and then they're going to come pick us up. And I was like, I had a moment of relief of being like, okay, if anything, I'm going to get out of here alive tonight because, you know, this is why these are my people. This is why these are my tribe.
Thank you so much for sharing that story with me, like, and us. I mean, that was intense. So before we wrap things up here, I just wanted, I guess you also touched on this too a little bit, but I just wanted a more clarification for those that are listening too as well. How can allies be better in being more intersectional and inclusive in our approach to not only BLM, but just queer Black American causes?
Ooh, so that's a great question. I love that we're ending that. So first and foremost, if you're an ally, I want you to say out loud that Black Lives Matter. And I want you to say it out loud every day because there's power in speaking that into the world. Secondly, I want you to understand that as you're saying Black Lives Matter, you not only need to say that out loud, but you need to actually embody that. Because more often than not, it's like you'll have in particular, like white people or people who claim to be allies have a Black Lives Matter sign outside of their door, right? But if a Black person's car broke down in their neighborhood and you came and knocked on their door, they would not let you in, nor would they help you, right? And so we really have to deconstruct how we see Black bodies as something to fear and something to be afraid of. And in particular, to Black queer people, see them, tell them that they are important, that it is important that we exist. Like something as though you've heard me speak as such a powerful person just now. One of my struggles that I go through is like, it's so challenging for me at times to feel like I have a right and I'm worthy of existing in this world, because I live in a world that constantly tells me that my gender expression is not okay, that my sexual orientation is not okay, that my Blackness and my form of Blackness is not okay. So if you want to truly be an ally, the best ally sign I've ever seen is held up by this white woman in a protest, and it was like, sorry I'm late, I had a lot to learn. So please be fucking late, but learn some shit. You know, if you're not learning, if you're not expanding your mind on what queer politics have been, around what Black existence has been and what it feels like, and how you've impacted and how you've used your white privilege or your privilege in general to overstep Black folks in their experience, then you're not truly doing the work. You can say Black Lives Matter all you want, but unless you're truly embodying it and holding space for people of color and the people of color in your life, you're not truly making a difference. You're not making a distance in the difference, on some real. Like one of my favorite, take it back to Trevor Noah, right? One of my favorite episodes is where, Roy, what's his name?
Roy Wood Jr. He's
Roy
so
Wood Jr.
funny.
He's talking to, there's that group that has white people pay a fee to receive a box on how they can do better, right? And one of my favorite things is that this like white ally woman is in this coffee shop, and she asked this white man in the shop to buy these Black women some coffee just because. And I was like, yeah, that's some real shit. Like, if you see people of color, you don't have to throw money at us, but to just tell us, like, I appreciate you and I want to recognize that it is my duty to do better, and to tell my people that it's our duty to do better. Because at the end of the day, if you want to truly be an ally and if you truly want to be a part of this work, you have to recognize that allyship looks like showing up to recognize you hold more power than we do in that regard, and that is your duty to call out other people, right? Like, it is never my job nor my duty to educate white people. And being a high yellow person, I will acknowledge it is my duty to educate other light-skinned people of color, because that is my burden. It's not the burden of other people who have deeper pigmentation or complexion as mine, because that's not their job. And I will say that is my labor to do. But in particular with white people in general, it's not my job, unless you're paying me as an educator, to educate you on the struggle and the shit that I've been through, the shit that my ancestors have been through, and all the current political climate. It is the job of other white people to educate you, because those are your people. They are supposed to hold you as accountable. So, yeah, I feel like that's very clear. Like, stop looking to people of color to educate you, and like on some real shit in the current time, stop with all these fucking apology videos. I don't want an apology video unless you're literally saying, hey, I'm sorry that my people sucked, but here is a tangible thing to make an impact in the wealth gap, right? Like, if you're a white person and you want to show me some love, sign over some goddamn land to me. Give me a deed to your house. Or like create a community, like sell me or like literally finance a community building in my neighborhood, because those are ways that we can actually tangibly get ahead versus giving us all this fucking white emotional labor to do, right? Like, it is not my job to hold space for you, Karen, and your white tears. It's just not my job. That's Bob's job, and maybe Bill's job too, but it's your job to get to Bill and Bob. It's not my job. My job is to take care of Keisha, Sharonda, Jordan, Brianna. Like, that is my duty, to heal these people that have been impacted. But it is not my job to hold space for these allies in that regard. Now, we can have different conversations around what does allyship look like, as this is an intersectional community and an intersectional movement, but stop putting the burden of teaching on other people other than yourselves. It's your duty to teach yourself. You're a capable person, and you have the power, and you're worthy of doing that work. But ultimately, you have to recognize that that's not our job. And in regards to the queer community, honestly, I would like people to reflect on what is their gender journey and how they felt about these different binaries. And if you're not aware of these binaries, please do the work to educate yourself. Queerness is an umbrella for wholeness and for all these different intersectionalities. And like, if you're a straight person as my friend, like on some real shit, you know that more often than not, the spaces that you enter will be catered to you versus me. And so hold space for that aspect, right? And don't group. And if you can do anything, please don't group queer people with gay people, because we're not the same. As we think about, like, in particular, California as a whole, right? The right to marriage, that's also something that people think about, right? And they're like, oh, well, do queer people when they get married? And like, on some real shit, like, if you're queer, you don't even believe in the establishment of marriage as this thing of like symbolizing people as property. And people need to be more aware of that. It doesn't mean that like you shouldn't have access to having rights, but like, shouldn't we all have access to, like, if this person is our caretaker or something like that, then they should have access to our medical care if you choose to legally do that. But why are we basing it on gender? Why are we basing it on same-sex couples, right? Like, what about the gender fluid queer trans person who's like, I want this person to receive these financial things from me so that they can be more supported. Quit putting things into a box and really like blow the box up. The box this whole time has never like catered to or supported us, right? So like, let's reimagine what we can actually do with the future. And honestly, I'm going to leave you on this note. What's the best that can happen if you deconstruct and reflect on where you've been so that we can actually go somewhere new?
And that's all for today's show. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow us, share with your friends, and rate us on Apple Podcasts. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter at Earth's Narrative. Special thanks to audio and visual director Francisco Echeverri. You can find him on Instagram at cisco.sound. All links will be in the description. Join us next week as we talk about reimagining the criminal justice system in America with Teddy Randall, veteran and law student at Emory Law. Thank you so much for listening, and we will continue this narrative next week.